evening and welcome. Just 2 months from today, Barbados enters a new chapter of our independence, having taken the decisive step of choosing a Barbadian as our head of state. Thank you for joining us for The Public View. This is the second in a series of 6 national consultations. We will continue again on Saturday, again on the 4th of October, Monday the 4th of October, Wednesday the 6th, and the final program will be on the 8th of October. We begin at 5 every evening and end at 6:30 or thereabouts. The purpose: to examine the draft charter of Barbados. This draft charter is just that. It is a draft that has been prepared to guide and support these public consultations, and it was produced by the Republican Status Transition Advisory Committee through a process of consultation with a wide group of stakeholders who gave their inputs. You are invited to ask your questions, seek clarifications, and most of all, we welcome your suggestions, whether on calls, WhatsApp, or audio and video submissions that you can make via email. All are welcome. And let me welcome Bonnie Leons, who is here with us this evening to ensure inclusion for equality. I'm Alison Leacock, and my co-host is Julian Rogers, who will introduce our panel. Good evening, Julian.
Good evening to you and everyone. Let's start first by introducing you to someone who appeared on the very first of this series, Sharita Granum, who is the co-chair of the subcommittee. And of course, you know her very well from her work across Barbados, but particularly her international experiences working within the United Nations grouping, and particularly a focus on this decade of recognition of Africa and the wide African diaspora. She's joined as well by Senator Dr. Reverend John Rogers. You know him well from St. George's Parish Church, and of course the special deanery activities in St. John's as well. And he is here for the second time in the session to respond to the comments and questions that you pose. This time, though, the panel is expanded to include Dr. Derek Murray, who is director of the Center for Hybrid Studies, and that's based right here in Barbados, the Research and Program Development Agency. And he is also a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, Science, Technology, and Medicine in Society, Gender Studies, as well as African Caribbean Traditional Religions. You know him well as being the first director of the Pan-African Affairs Unit of the Government of Barbados, and he designed and established and sat on the government's task force on reparations. Also known to you is Michelle Braffett. She is the regional coordinator for the English-speaking Caribbean for the OHCHR. She's a former national human rights advisor in the Office of Barbados and the OECS. In her role, Ms. Braffett worked with Caribbean governments to better engage the United Nations international human rights system. And after graduating law school, she worked for several years as a corporate transactional lawyer in California and as a legal consultant, both in Barbados, California, and Toronto. So we've got quite a panel for you to respond to your questions and comments. We'd love to hear from you. So let's get started.
And indeed, the first session of business is really a hangover from on Tuesday. We had a number of calls and suggestions, and some of them we didn't have enough time to address them. So we want to do that first of all in this first segment of the program, even though tonight we want to shine a spotlight on fundamental principles, rights, and freedoms, the duties of us as citizens to the state and the state to us as citizens, as well as our emerging rights. But before we do that, I think we should go back to one of the questions that was raised on Tuesday. A caller had spoken about the suggestion of creating a Citizens Advice Bureau. And I think based on the RSTAC's consultations with the Ombudsman, I'd like to invite Sharita to address this, and perhaps then Michelle could speak to the merits of a national human rights institution. But Sharita, perhaps you should begin.
Well, thank you so much, Alison, and good evening to all of our viewers. I think I forgot my manners last time and missed all the excitement, so I'm not repeating that mistake today. Good evening. So our staff would have held a number of consultations with several agencies across the public service in line with a number of obligations under our terms of reference. And the whole point was really to assess any variations arising from the change in policy, if any, resulting from the transition to republic status. Now, some of the sentiments shared rightly belong to the period of consultation that is set aside for the constitutional reform amendments. However, they bear significant relevance to this discussion. Now, the caller that Alison would have referenced would have spoken to the need for a Citizens Advice Bureau. And I'm sure the caller will find some synergies with the years-long dialogue on the expansion of the Office of the Ombudsman to a national human rights institution. Such an institution would be an independent and agency and obligated to monitor any situation of a violation of human rights which was subject to an investigation. It would advise the government and any other competent authority on matters of specific violations on legislative issues such as compliance and implementation of international human rights instruments. It would have a mandate to educate and inform the public on the subject of human rights. And importantly, it would be permitted some level of quasi-judicial competence. So the caller made a very, very valid point in terms of introducing Citizens Advice Bureau, and it should feature within the context of the constitutional reform consultations. But I want to add that when one really considers the state action criterion, there's a very interesting gap that's highlighted. And currently, the only remedial action to be sought related to alleged breaches of constitutional rights is against the state. Matters between private persons must be addressed within statute or common law, and where no such law exists, there really is no legal recourse. So I want to pause here in the event that I'm accused of being some form of a bush lawyer. I have been accused of that on many occasions before, and leave some space for Michelle, as Alison invited earlier, to elaborate a bit more on state action criteria, as well as the National Human Rights Institution and role in society.
Yes, I agree with that. And Michelle, we welcome you for your first contribution as a subject matter expert and allow you to weigh in on this matter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good evening as well to everyone. And I'm very grateful for the invitation to join you this evening. I think I can definitely speak with regard to national human rights institutions. And although, Sharita, you covered most of the highlights. But national human rights institutions are an important part, a critical part of a country's national human rights infrastructure. Interestingly enough, no Caribbean country has a national human rights institution that meets international standards. Ombudsman's offices, parliamentary commissioners come close, but there's a higher standard that NHRIs need to meet that are, as Sharita said, they must be fully independent, yes? And they must be via legislation given the authority to have quasi-judicial authority to hear human rights complaints. But as Sharita also said, national human rights institutions can also serve as a forum for human rights discussion and developments on the national level. And you know, the truth is that most countries have a national human rights institution that meets these standards. As I said, Caribbean countries right now do not. And the options are limited in terms of remedial action and avenues for remedy without a national human rights institution. And then as it relates to human rights violations, it is true that when it comes at least to international human rights law, it is the state that we to provide, you know, to protect, fulfill, and respect human rights. It is a state obligation first and foremost. And having a national human rights institution is part of the way the state meets its human rights obligations to the people within its country. But I'll hold off there for now, and we can continue to have this conversation throughout the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think, I hope that the caller who made that suggestion on Tuesday was able to hear both of your contributions, and perhaps is free to call us back this evening if he would like to have some further discussion on it. The second question from members of the public, that question was very straightforward. Who is going to police this charter? I'm going to throw this to Sharita again to explain some of the concepts that are entrenched in the charter itself and its implications with a question such as that.
Thank you. I'll do my absolute best to make this as simple and straightforward as possible. So the Citizens Charter, as it is presented in the discussion draft, is in a non-justiciable form. And all non-justiciable means is that it's not enforceable in a court of law. So the Citizens Charter is really a symbolic representation of who we are, what we stand for and want to uphold, and that imagines us at our best. It's really a benchmark for national growth and progress. So, and there are justiciable or entrenched charters, entrenched meaning forming a core part of the Constitution itself. But here I am, I'm delving into Bush lawyer yet again. So perhaps I should allow Michelle to speak a bit more on the merits or demerits of justiciable versus non-justiciable or entrenched charters versus unentrenched.
Yes, I mean, listen, I actually think that they are places for both justiciable and non-justiciable instruments. I think that this is a good start, right, in terms of at least putting down on paper from a national perspective what our aspirations are as a people. Yes. But with that said, the next step is absolutely to make it enforceable. Yes, that is how human rights are protected. That is how human rights are realized, is that you have legal recourse if your rights are violated, that you have legal recourse to look to say that my right is enshrined in this justiciable document in our national legislation. But with that said, I would say that the Charter arguably reflects much of what is already in our constitutions. And I would argue that we should use the Charter first and foremost to have that national conversation around who we are, and then absolutely ensure that the terms or the provisions of the Charter are enshrined in our legislation such that they are enforceable, because the ability to enforce our rights is a critical part of human rights. But there are roles for both enforceable and non-enforceable instruments. So I think this is a good start. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think it is also important to make that distinction that the Charter is in many ways a precursor to a far more robust contribution that will be made with regard to discussion about the Constitution itself. And that begins, of course, in January 2022. Julian, I believe you have some more questions from our audience that we weren't able to address on Tuesday.
Right. Well, one of them really is very simple. Why is sexual orientation included in the categories for protection from discrimination? And I suppose I'd like to put that to two people. First of all, Senator Rogers, and to Derek as well, to give him an opportunity to weigh in on this. Senator Rogers, would you be the first?
Yes, sure. Certainly, no problem. Good evening, everyone. The inclusion of sexual orientation, as I would have mentioned in the last program, came out of the submissions made by persons to the committee, but also it was there in the 1998 report. There were persons calling for gender and sexual orientation to be added to the categories for protection against discrimination. And it is really a complex human sexuality issue. You cannot have sex without including gender and sexual orientation. And so rightly, the committee has placed all three of them there together because they represent different things. Within the context of our modern day understanding of our human construct where sexuality is concerned, I believe that it was the United Nations from about 2015 or so started recognizing that sex is not binary as we once thought, that there are persons that fall somewhere in the middle between the traditional sexual constructs of male and female. Those persons are now referred to as intersex. In the past, they were derogatorily referred to as hermaphrodites, or in ancient times, the males were considered to be congenital eunuchs. It's there in the Bible as well as cultures in antiquity. And so, if we're going to recognize that there are people that are different, and by intersex we mean, for example, for those who are watching the Olympics recently, you recognize that more often we're hearing about DSD athletes. This is difference of sex development, where persons may have genitalia or hormonal or chromosomal constructs that render them not fully male or female. There are several conditions which can cause this. For example, androgen receptor deficiency, or there's 5-alpha reductase deficiency. There's also congenital adrenal hyperplasia and also hypospadias. And all of these can cause developmental problems with genitalia. Now, traditionally, what people would do is you look at the baby when it's born and assign a sex to it as male or female. Well, there are some babies born in the world when they're born, the doctors cannot tell whether they're male or female. In the past, persons would, with permission of parents, conduct an operation on site and determine that they're either male or female. But what they found over time is that sometimes these children develop and they're not the sex that would have been assigned to them as birth. They do not lean towards that sex. In other words, they adopt now a gender expression or a gender identity which does not fit the assigned sex. And so coming out of that, the United Nations has said, no, we need to stop this mutilation of our children. We need to stop this torture. Allow the children to develop and determine what gender identity they will accept, because some of them, though they may have female or male genitalia, their chromosomal construct may be male, XY. And so they can develop what we refer to as gender dysphoria. And so they may be assigned a particular sex, but the gender that they identify with, or even the gender they express, which is their mannerisms and so on, may not match the sex assigned. And what happens there then is that you now have a person with a gender identity that may not fit the sex that they have been assigned. And this is where we go to sexual orientation now, because your orientation is really the sex to which you're attracted emotionally, romantically, etc. And so it is quite possible and normal that some of these people, because of their gender identity that does not fit their sex, they will be attracted to a sex that may be the same sex to which they're assigned, but remember their gender is not matching the sex to which they're assigned. It's a little complicated and it's a lot of science involved. And so we thought that in the world, for example, 140 million babies are born each year, and 0.08% of them are intersex. That is just over 110,000. But along with intersex and the actual phenotypic identities in terms of ambiguous genitalia, there are also many more persons born with hormonal and chromosomal differences. For example, there's Klinefelter syndrome, where a male can have XXY, which is an extra female chromosome, and then he will develop breasts and hips and so on and start taking on a female look. So there are all these things there, and within the world, 1.7% of the people are born with all those conditions now. And so that's about 2.4 million every year. And so what we're seeking to do in this Constitution is say, look, the law must look after every citizen. And if there's one person in Barbados who falls into this category, he or she must have the freedom and space to live in the country of his or her birth. This is the land that nurtured them. And a lot of people have committed suicide. A lot of people have had developmental problems psychologically because of the way society perceives them as freaks or abnormal when they've been born that way. They didn't do anything to make themselves that way. And as a mature society, I believe it is time that we pay serious attention to them and grant them their space to live and grow freely in the country that they've been born in.
Thank you very much. I must bring in Dr. Murray here on this, because I'd give you an opportunity, sir, to expand on the real danger of discrimination in an environment like the senator has just described.
First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to Sharita and Senator Rogers for inviting the Center for Hybrid Studies to make a contribution to this discussion about the Charter. I should make it clear that we are not part of writing the Charter, so we're not here to defend aspects of it. We're here to do a critique just like the public. And there are many things. There are many things that I find credible about the Charter, and that specific question about sexual orientation. That's one of those things that I think should be included. I do not know why we would want to discriminate against anyone for any reason, and including sexual orientation. The point that was made by Senator Rogers has to do, the points have to do with genetic and biological determinism, things that are determined by our biology and so on. But it is also entirely possible that someone may simply choose to be gay. They may either choose it, or they may have a tendency, or for whatever reason, it may not be something in the genetics that we can go and locate. And I cannot see why we would want to be discriminating against someone like that. But usually what it is that you have personal prejudices. You know, you can afford to have your personal prejudice. Nobody can stop you from saying, well, I don't want to be associated with someone who's gay. I don't want personally to be associated with homosexuals. But then to raise that to the level of preventing that person from finding work, or getting an education, or living life without interference is problematic. We must remember that in Barbados that we have a history of enslavement, and we, more than most people, should be extremely sensitive to any issue of discrimination on any grounds whatsoever, because we know what it is to have a legacy of being considered subhuman. And we shouldn't import, you know, the Afrocentric scholar by the name of Marimba Annie. She wrote a book called Urugu, and in that book she makes the point that we shouldn't import the European. It's really a European habit of everywhere that we see a difference, then we ascribe a hierarchy and then discriminate on the section that's inferior. So we shouldn't, because somebody is different, because they love somebody in a different way than we would normally do, we should not allow an environment where they can be prevented from earning a living, from being socialized the way that everybody else is socialized. So for me, sexual orientation is not problematic to put in a charter, especially since a charter, to my mind, and that's what we're discussing, is, for me, should really be a philosophical statement, an anchor that makes sure that regardless of how the Constitution evolves, how laws spring from that, and what policies we develop, that we have a minimum framework, extremes to which we will not go in terms of the way we treat people. And so a charter should really state the extremes to which things that we will not allow in terms of discrimination against particular sectors of the society.
Dr. Murray, I want you to hold your horses right there, because I want to come back to you and pose another question posed by a caller at our last session. And at the same time, I want to remind people that this is the public view, and we expect that you'll get on the phone. You'll also send a voice message via the facility of WhatsApp. And of course, we expect that you will take even more time looking at the charter and sending in your responses and comments, etc. So let me stay with you, Dr. Murray, because one of the questions you had last time revolved around reparations. And in fact, in Article 1 of the Charter, there is reference to that. But I think here's an opportunity for you to reinforce the value that has been put on reparations in the Charter.
Yes, that's one of the important issues that the Commission for Pan-African Affairs, when I headed that, got going. I mean, of course, there were calls for reparations from the Rastafari community, from various Pan-Africanists for years. And that's because, if you have studied our history, you really understand the history of our spirituality, our ways of knowing our life ways, you will be shocked at how much we have lost in terms of our development, in terms of our knowledge systems, in terms of our traditions. We are not supposed to be developmentally at the point where we are. Very often we're blamed for not being enterprising enough, for not being astute enough, for not being skilled enough. And therefore our societies are considered to be undeveloped or underdeveloped because we have not done the things that we were supposed to do. What people miss is that we've had 300 years of forces of oppression, of tremendous brutality, of blocking every avenue and every possible path to development, to the point where we not only have societies that are underdeveloped, almost every Black society across the world, but we can also trace the health impacts from 200 years of trauma that we've experienced, everything from hypertension to diabetes and so on. So what we are seeing is that there are a couple of reasons why we need reparations on the table. One of them, of course, is to pay for what was done, in terms of pay financially, but also pay in terms of exchange of technology. There are several ways that can be repaid, debt forgiveness and so on. But there's also the question of we cannot afford to let such an atrocity in human history go without an apology and without being repaid, because there's always the danger that it can be repeated, and it will be repeated. What we are saying to the world is that humanity, all humanity, should be treated in a particular way. They're minima in terms of how low we will go in terms of our morals and how we treat each other, that we should not go. And that if you decide that you're going to go in that direction, that you will have to pay for that. And that is, we've seen that the Jewish community has insisted that it will never happen to them again. And then their way of doing that is to make sure that you pay for whatever you do, and that every last Nazi is hunted down in every corner of the world from here till whenever time ends, to make sure it doesn't happen again. So reparations for us is not negotiable in terms of whether it will happen or not. It will be on the table, and it will be there. The enslavement went on for 300 years. We don't expect to be asking for reparations for 300 years. But if need be, we will fight it for 300 years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. I just want to go back to the question, well, part of the discussion and the response coming from Senator Rogers earlier. I should really have added this on to the original question, where person suggested that the reference to family in the Charter was really a reference to the traditional model of a family. And I think you might just spend a little moment there, Senator Rogers, just clarifying that.
Well, in the Barbados context, following on from everything Dr. Murray just mentioned, as a Caribbean people, family for us was far from traditional. I think we are well aware that in the Caribbean society, we're more or less a matriarchal type society coming out of the legacy of slavery, where our men were bucks, used to simply impregnate the women to produce a good workforce. And coming out of that, Caribbean society has more or less been matriarchal, and extended family and multi-generational family. So the traditional, if they're speaking of traditional within the context of the nuclear family, certainly that was not predominantly the Caribbean or Barbadian experience. But we must take family a little further here now when we're considering these matters of the 21st century, because if we're going to speak of avoiding discrimination against persons, especially persons in the LGBTI group, we also have to look at the concept of those people and their right to family as well. Of course, that is a matter of policy, and every government has a right to ensure that every citizen within its realm has the opportunity to live out their lives with freedom and equality, and with the space to develop just as every other citizen can. I think it was Anatole France who once says, "The law in its majestic splendor forbids the rich as well as the poor from sleeping on the bridges, drinking from drains, and eating from garbage cans. The law must cover everyone and give everyone space to exist in Barbados."
Senator, thank you very much. And we're giving everybody space here on the public view to contribute to the discussion about the Charter. And remember, all of the ideas that you put on the table are to be considered by the committee in the final version. So you need to really take the opportunity that you are now provided with to make your contribution, whether you do so on the phone or by WhatsApp or by email or letter, as the case may be. But right now, the immediate facility for you is to call 228-5562 or 228-5563. And the WhatsApp, it works. If you put a voice note on the WhatsApp, hey, we can handle that. 228-5562, so you don't have to hold on. And go to Facebook, at Facebook, yeah, right. At CBC Barbados is there, and at GIS Barbados. So all the facilities are there for you to be part of the public view. Alison?
Thank you very much, Julian. And we look forward to those calls. And while we await our first caller for this afternoon, perhaps we could indeed shine a light on the whole question of fundamental principles, rights, and freedoms. I want to ask Michelle, based on her work in the area of human rights, to describe those and define those as you see them for our audience, and to really tell us, do you see them as conditional?
Thank you very much. I mean, certainly I can give you a quick definition of fundamental rights and freedoms. Fundamental rights and freedoms, or human rights, are those basic rights that every single human being is born into simply by virtue of being human. Yes? So by being a human being, there are certain universal, inalienable rights that applies to everyone. And they are not, quote unquote, conditional. So I will say that there are certain fundamental rights that apply to all of us. Now, those rights are not necessarily always absolute, right? So for example, we have a right to liberty. However, if we break the law, the state reserves the ability provided that it follows due process, to deprive you of your right to liberty. So it's not always universal, or rather I should say it's not always illegal, so to speak, to not meet rights. But by the same token, these fundamental human rights are not subject to conditionality or to opinion or to philosophy. I think one of the ways in which to think about rights is to think about the principles that underlie those rights. Why are these rights so sacrosanct? Why is it that you have to meet an extraordinarily high standard to deny somebody of those rights? And that's because the principles that underlie those rights are the principles of fairness, of dignity, of respect, and of equality, right? So the concept or the principle of equality is non-negotiable, always, right? The principle of fairness, at least the society that we aspire to have, right, must always be fair. Fairness cannot be undermined by our systems, by our institutions. So when we speak about fundamental rights, we are talking about rights that are theoretically sacrosanct to our society. And it has to meet the highest level for those rights, for those rights to in any way be abridged. And there has to be a very, very strong social reason to do so, for the state to do so. Again, as I said earlier, the state actually has a legal obligation under international human rights law to respect human rights, protect human rights, and fulfill human rights. Again, keeping along the lines of the principles of fairness, dignity, respect, and equality. Those are the different obligations that governments have, and those obligations are not conditional. The government has an obligation to protect and respect the civil rights of every single person that it has control over. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. And like I said, if you're struggling with the rights concept, I would encourage you to think about the principles concept, right? When we're talking about how we want to move forward, are we going to move forward in a way that is fair, that respects human dignity of everyone, that respects equality? I think that is one of the helpful ways of thinking about it. And again, fundamental human rights are not conditional.
Thank you. And that really is a great way for us to welcome our first caller. I think it's really an opportunity for us to hear from the people of Barbados. And we have our first caller this evening. We're just past the mark for the next hour or so. And therefore, we welcome our first caller to the public view. What is your view this evening? And we welcome you to share it with the panel.
Hi, good evening. My name is Mia Brassett.
Good evening.
And I am the LGBTQ+ representative on the Social Justice Committee. So that's just the context from which I'm speaking. And I just want to preface what I'm saying. Thank you. I just want to preface what I'm saying by pointing out that I am a proud Barbadian. I am extremely patriotic. I get goosebumps when the anthem marching Independence Day parade as a cadet. And however, as a member of the LGBT community, I often feel that my value as a citizen is not appreciated and not valued. And for context, I consider myself to have many privileges opposed to Barbadians. For instance, I highly educated, etc. But despite all of my privileges that I have, that I can enjoy, I do sometimes feel like my country doesn't love me the way that I love it. I think we can all agree that no Barbadian should feel this way. And I know that sentiment is much stronger among the least privileged and in the LGBT community. However, all that being said, I really think it's laudable that the charter is being done, and I really appreciate the sentiment shared by the panelists so far, because it really should represent all Barbadians, every single Barbadian, and all must mean all. And also, I just want to say that what I'm going to say represents my views, but I also did some consultation with other key stakeholders in the community, so it should be an inclusive and comprehensive contribution, hopefully. So it is kind of going to be detailed. I'm going to go through, I hope that's okay, go through certain sections of it and kind of point out the comments that we have. So in the preamble.
Well, we certainly welcome that, Mia.
Okay, great. All right, so in the preamble, the 7th paragraph, I believe.
Go ahead, you finish your thought.
Yeah, okay. So in the 7th paragraph of the preamble, that begins with underscoring. It says underscoring the fact that we are all equal in the eyes of the Creator. I think this may or may not be a controversial statement, but I do think that that may seem as though it alienates an immediate group of people, because we need to remember that atheists and agnostics are also Barbadians. And I think that a good way to phrase it would be by we're all equal by virtue of being human. And also I think that's important in the context of the laws, because we all know that there have been laws, for instance, apartheid laws, for instance, the laws in the Nazi regime that were anti-human rights. So I don't even think it matters that in the eyes of the laws of the land, it should be by virtue of being human. I think that actually is a more absolute statement that is important. That's just a comment and a suggestion. Or it could also be included alongside the laws of the land and in the eyes of the Creator, because I think it just needs to be driven home. And then in Article 1, in the first paragraph, obviously I'm very glad to see sex, gender, and sexual orientation, and I really appreciate how it's been explained so far this evening. So thank you very much for that. I also think it's important to let the public know that there are very harrowing statistics on homelessness, poverty, survival sex work, suicide in the community, and exclusion only exacerbates those issues. Exclusion causes those issues, so it's extremely important that everybody's mentioned, regardless of whether or not you think it's a choice or whether or not you agree. Right, so another point I would like to raise is about the word tolerance. I can see why tolerance was included and was used throughout the document, but it has often been used to refer to the LGBT community. It can have a negative connotation because the word is sometimes weaponized. It's kind of used as something called, I'm sure you're familiar with the term dog whistle politics. So it is like, yeah, we will not actively discriminate against you, but we're going to ignore you. And therefore that results in indirect discrimination, which is just as bad. So I think tolerance can have a negative connotation. If tolerance is to be left in the document, I think it should be accompanied by inclusion, the word inclusion. I know inclusion and inclusive is in some parts of the document, but I think every time tolerance is mentioned, we should also mention inclusion. All right. And then further in the same Article 1, there's a section entitled Towards a Just Society. And for instance, in the last paragraph, it says that we recognize the many ways in which cultures, language, etc. are used as a tool to separate the people of our Caribbean community. And I think it should also include laws. So languages, cultures, and laws that were historically used as tools to separate the people, because as we know, there have been discriminatory laws in Barbados, some still exist. I think it's important to recognize that it has also been structural and done by the state. And it kind of goes back to my previous point about laws of the land. And then also in the second paragraph, I don't have many more points, just to let you know. So in the second paragraph of that entitled diversity, there's mention of a term called those people. And I understand what it's trying to say, but those people can kind of seem othering. It can seem alienating, and I just would kind of point out that like language needs to be nuanced. So I think those people perhaps should be given some consideration whether that term should be included or not. And the Article 2, in the second paragraph, is to be the true keepers of our brothers and sisters. And that is quite a good statement, but it should be mindful of the fact that that is very gendered language. And obviously, if, as was mentioned, actually by the panel, if gender is not binary, therefore you need to make sure that you don't express gender in binary language, right? So each other would be a good replacement for that, for brothers and sisters. And then a key point I just really want to raise is family. And I'm glad that families are explained in the right way, because the right to found a family is critical. Because if the family is meant to be the key driver of our future, then everybody must have a right to family. And I'm not sure if this is something ready for the charter, but if we're going to have family, we need to think about how to facilitate family, like affordable childcare, parental leave, fertility treatment, adoption, etc. So I think that's something also to be considered. And there's something that there's also family of choice, because family is a function. And that's something very common in the LGBT community, having a family of choice, especially when one is kicked out of the house. At an early age, you have to find your own family. So, the diverse family groups have always been, but I think beyond the whole matriarchal society, there should be recognition of chosen family. Then, the last two contributions, so for Article 3, in the first paragraph, is a mention of duty to participate in economic and political and social life. And it would be good to include right and duty, because if it's a right, then you must not have a situation where people are inhibited or face obstacles to exercise that duty, which has also happened in the LGBT community. And then also in that paragraph, under democracy, I think there really should be a reference to the impediments that a person faces due to intersection vulnerabilities. And so, for instance, if you're in the LGBT community, you're disabled, you're from a low socioeconomic background, all at the same time, I think there needs to be a recognition of that particular vulnerability, and therefore we have a duty to make sure that we recognize that and we address that. So I think it would be good to include that. And the last point is on the rights of the child, which I realize is absent from the charter. And I think that we need to move away from the concept in Barbadian culture that children must be seen and not heard, because it again alienates children and young people who often feel that they're not heard and people don't listen, or it's just tokenism when they're included. I'm a young person. I'm under 30, and I know that people often say we're not politically engaged, but we are, and we do care. And I think it's important to recognize the rights of the child as well, people under 18, and also the rights of younger people. So those are my contributions. And thank you very much for letting me make all of them.
Wow. Yeah, you have raised some really deep discussion points, very incisive analysis. The fact that you have gone through the document means that, you have thought very carefully about the language and the nuanced implications that you've submitted. And I would really welcome your continued engagement throughout these consultations. I believe that you have raised a number of issues that were on the cards for this afternoon, but certainly one that caught my attention was the matter of tolerance, the use of the word tolerance, which certainly from my own past work in the field of HIV has been a major point of discussion of whether we go for tolerance versus acceptance, tolerance versus respect. These are issues, and I'd like to invite Senator Rogers to kick in and respond to that. And we do have as well a number of comments from Facebook. So perhaps what I'll do is let Senator Rogers respond and then go to the comments that we have. The first one there on the screen. So Senator Rogers.
I do understand the point made about tolerance and how within modern context it can be seen as a dog whistle in some communities. But I think in the context of the Charter, it was meant to be used in the purest sense of the word. Because remember, we are building a community. It takes time for trust and so on, and understanding, education and everything to be imparted. I will lean towards the side of Voltaire, who said, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend your right to say it. We're moving towards acceptance and the like, but to put it within the context of respect. Respect is something that is earned. And sometimes it is earned not because people are not worthy of respect, but because people do not understand or know what you're about. And there's never been any real connection. So these are things that take time. So respect cannot be demanded. It is earned over time as we move towards a greater appreciation of self, towards a greater acceptance of who people are. I'm just seeing it within that context.
Thank you, Senator Rogers. We have two questions from Facebook, CBC's Facebook, as well as the Barbados Government Information Service Facebook page. Kay Blades is asking, will the Charter replace the Constitution? And that sounds to me as if that is a question that falls squarely within the purview of Sharida.
Okay, well, my short answer. My short answer is no. Really, the charter as presented and dependent on whether Barbados accepts that this is the way that they would like the charter to be contextualized, is a necessary prerequisite to going into those discussions around constitutional reform. We would have mentioned earlier that the charter really is an aspirational document. It is emblematic. It is of the same. It should be of the same level as our anthem, or flag, or national pledge. It houses and showcases us at the best representation that a Barbadian individual, organization, institution, or state should be and should function like. But my question is, what is that common ground, that collective position that you are judging the value or the quality of the what's contained in an instrument like a constitution against? And that is the charter. So no, it does not replace the Constitution. It is simply a benchmark, a mirror to hold the Constitution as a manifestation of the things that should come out of the Charter up against. And all of the other functions of our society, if it's not living up to the aspirations that are housed in the Charter, really you need to come again. That is precisely how a Charter should function, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Sharida. More questions from Facebook, this time from the Government Information Service Facebook page. From Patricia Ben, will the Charter be a part of the education curriculum in order to make it more meaningful as we seek to shape the future of Barbados? And I think I will throw that one to Dr. Murray. Would you like to have your perspective on that question?
Well, I mean, if we do have the charter, then of course it should be part of part of any child's education, even before they reach secondary school. I, however, want to say that on the table, since we are coming to the public, we should still have on the table whether it is necessary to have a charter separate from a constitution. I mean, the question that was just asked is a good one, which is, what will be the difference between the charter and the constitution? It's a question that I had myself, and something that we have to think carefully about. So the charter, if we do have one, if the public does decide that it is necessary, then we have to distinguish what we place in the charter from what's already covered in the constitution. My own opinion is that it should, we should have a charter, because the constitution is about laws and governance and organs of government and how we structure government. But not everything that a society aspires to be can be covered in laws and legal terminology and legal jargon. So I think prior to the Constitution, we do need an explication, a philosophical grounding of where we're intending to go as a people and what type of society we want to forge. What are the ideals? What are these ideals that we wish to work within? Because as you well know, the Constitution is something that is precisely the Constitution and the laws that flow from it. Those are precisely the things that we fight over as a society. Some people want more government, some people want less government. Those are the things that we fight on. The Constitution evolves over time. The Charter really should last 300 years, at least. And therefore, we should, in that Charter, focus only on those philosophical groundings, the moral compass, the things that we will and will not accept. Some of the things that were mentioned earlier by Michelle about or what it means to be a human and to have dignity and respect. Those are the things that should be enshrined in the Charter for us to go forward with, to then forge the Constitution. Because the current Constitution would just be one, or whatever Constitution we come up with in the next few years, would just be one manifestation of how we can achieve what we want in the Charter. There may be other formations. So for example, in the Charter, they speak about the social partnership, trade unions, and so on. I don't necessarily think those types of things should be included in the Charter because we don't know what formations will exist in the future to achieve these same goals. Long 75 years from now, trade unions may be irrelevant and outmoded because we've found a different way for society to share and distribute the benefits of production. So it's important that we not set it, we not write the Charter in such a way that it is almost a copy of the Constitution. I want to, before I end though, say acknowledge the contribution that was made by the young lady representing the LGBTQ constituency. I was going through my draft as she was going through hers, and almost word for word, we had the same comments, concerns, changes, and so on. So I want to congratulate her. I want to suggest that they seriously think about philosophical moorings and groundings and how whatever they submit will last for the next 150 years. But yes, to answer the question, it should be taught in schools.
Thanks so much, Dr. Murray. We do have a caller on the line. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. Hello?
On the public view. Go right ahead. Good evening.
Good evening to the distinguished panel, and thank you for accepting my call. I would like to make a comment which does not respond specifically to the draft charter, but it responds to the wider question of what kind of Barbados would we like to see in the future. May I?
Please do. The floor is yours. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, my comment was made at a previous meeting with the Barbados Association of Retired Persons, with the committee earlier, but I thought I should make it to this committee today, as I think it is of vital importance for us to consider as we move forward. The comment is as follows. Eradicating poverty in all its forms remains one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. The United Nations has prioritized the eradication of poverty in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are to be achieved by 2030. I believe that one of the fundamental objectives of the new charter, in my view, should be the eradication of poverty in Barbados. In this way, the charter would respond not only to those who live in the heights and the terraces, but it also creates a platform for hope a platform for policy, and a platform for actions and programs to improve the quality of life for the poor and the vulnerable of our society. Such a goal and the implementation of the same would ensure that the poor and vulnerable have equal rights to economic resources and access to basic services, including water, education, health services, and strategies to provide greater access to housing, land, educational opportunities, appropriate technology, and financial resources should be developed to provide a future where inequality is reduced in our society. In my view, it is important to recognize that poverty can be the source of many ills in our society, including domestic violence and antisocial behavior, crime and malnutrition, poor infrastructure, social tensions that threaten to divide the nation into the haves and the have-nots. In addition, the prevalence of disease, poor health, low productivity, anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem are all evidence of the effects of poverty in our country. In children, poverty stunts physical growth and development. Poverty hinders social and emotional development. Poverty shortens life expectancy. Poverty inflates infant and child mortality rates. Poverty increases the likelihood that a child will have chronic health problems. Poverty ravages children with preventable diseases. Poverty creates and perpetuates and widens the achievement gap. Poverty increases parental stress and impairs parental practices. Poverty increases violence in our society. In a recent report, the Inter-American Development Bank indicated that 7,000 households or 35,000 persons as classified as living in poverty in Barbados. If we consider that there are about 100,000 households in Barbados, then 7,000 households would represent just 7% of our population. The figure is low when compared to many areas of the world. And it is not beyond us in this 21st century, in a world of global prosperity, to end poverty in Barbados. Ladies and gentlemen, we will not reach our development goals if this noble charter, or if one part of our society lives in material prosperity and the others live in poverty. A strategy of poverty reduction, elimination imply that we will pursue people-centered development strategies that will improve infrastructure, housing, entrepreneurship, and access to capital and markets for the poor. Let the elimination of poverty be a development objective of Barbados. Let Barbados be the first small island developing state to eliminate poverty. Thank you. Those are my comments. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate your thoughtful intervention. Julian, I believe you have some feedback as well and some questions.
Yeah, so well, I just wanted to compliment the caller for his contribution, particularly because I think it is a good example of exactly what we expect the public contribution to be here on the Public View. And so we want to encourage you to get on the phone and, of course, use the voice mode of WhatsApp, 228-5562. And, of course, at Facebook, you will then be able to deliver more of your comments there as well at CBC Barbados or at JS Barbados on Facebook. But I want to share with you, or we want to share with you, something that came from the public, because we hit the street to ask a very pointed question. Do you believe that as Barbadians, we have a responsibility to each other? Here is the public's view.
I believe personally that it is our due or our right, to make sure that we look out for our young ones, and not only your friends, your families, your workmates, whatever, that we play our part too, because we're protecting not only ourselves, but we're protecting our loved ones, and as a result of that, we're also helping to protect each other out there, so by extension too. So yes, we have a part to play, and I do believe that we should be looking out for each other.
We should look out for each and every one of us, all these the same.
Yes, I do believe we have a responsibility to each other, because if we don't look out for each other, who else is going to look out for us?
So there you are then, reinforcing a particularly interesting viewpoint, but I think that we can all agree that as Barbadians, we all tend to look out for each other. So many of us have been raised by grandmothers and aunties and uncles and many other as well, and by neighbors as well. So we've got a lot of examples here in Barbados of looking after each other. So get on the line and let's have your feedback. Alison?
Thank you, Julian. I think the Vox Pops raised the issue as well, in my view, about that duty of care, not just us for each other, but with regard to the state. What is the state's responsibility to us as citizens, and what are our responsibilities as citizens to the state? And I'd very much like to invite Senator Rogers, as well as Dr. Murray, to weigh in on this matter, because I think we often wait and we're very quick to talk about what our rights are, but have we fully understood or embraced our rights and responsibilities, both to the state and from the state to us? So Senator Rogers, perhaps you could kick off on this one.
Well, within the context of Barbados, I think we're speaking to the converted when we're speaking about duty of state and duty of citizens to state. Because as I've mentioned in other forums, Barbados is one of the greatest examples of social democracy in the world. And it is enshrined here in our draft charter on the equitable development, where it speaks to the second paragraph: we commit to giving time, energy, resources to our communities and national organizations. And then it goes on to say, we remain conscious that every generation is indebted to the one which preceded it, and morally obligated to the ones that follow. And that is really what Barbados is. It's a continuum. But I think the reason for this charter, and the very reason why this charter has emerged, is because somehow within our community, that sense of being responsible for each other and doing what we can to make this nation better, recognizing that true national development doesn't come from simply doing what is required of us, but going beyond the call of duty, looking out for persons beyond the call of duty. And so the way our nation is set up, that if people really understand, as I said, I've shared my story about my education and so on in Barbados, where I couldn't believe when I went to school that they gave you all these textbooks and these exercise books for next to nothing. And then you can go back and exchange the exercise book when it's written out. That was unheard of. That was like education heaven to me. And so I made the decision that I will make the best possible use of this opportunity. And I believe that that is lost on some of our younger people in Barbados, where they do not understand that it's a continuum, and they're really indebted to the generation that's passed and morally obligated to the one that comes. So that's my take on that. I think Dr. Murray was.
You can go to the call, I guess.
This is the public view. You're on the line there.
Yeah, yes, sir. Reverend Rogers, Senator Reverend Rogers just mentioned going beyond the call of duty, and a caller spoke about poverty and its effects. Now, the caller who spoke about poverty and its effects was, in my judgment, beyond. I think he expatiated brilliantly, and he captured a very real social problem. Now, I'm going to agree with him and agree with Dr. Rogers about going beyond the call of duty in terms of this. We definitely in Barbados have for some time had an underclass. In sociological terms, an underclass is comprised of those who are so poor as being barely eking out an existence or living in squalor, or if not squalor, living in unacceptable circumstances. Now, one of the features of the underclass, and Dr. Rogers mentioned it earlier without mentioning underclass, is that in the family structure, there are women who, for many reasons, have a lot of children and cannot make ends meet. And to some extent, that reflects the family structure. But at the same time, what happens is that there are lots of females who have not done well at all, who are very poor. And this poverty is like a cycle. Like a woman 1 year might have a couple children, and 15, 16 years after, those children end up being as poor as their mother. And a cycle revolving and evolving develops. And the consequence is that a lot of people get left back. Now, if we have a duty of care to all our citizens, we cannot afford to leave people out of the loop. We cannot afford to have people suffering so badly as not to afford the basics in life, or people who have to look to handouts, sometimes handouts coming from the wrong people, or even when they come from well-meaning people, these handouts do not edify or lift people up. So in social terms, our duty of care must extend to embrace those people who, through lack of education, lack of opportunity, lack of finance, lack of savings, not being able to participate in things like credit unions and such like, are actually suffering. Now, right now, Dr. Murray did mention that this charter should go on and on for a long time. But in the context of the current pandemic has actually exacerbated the plight of the underclass. Now, a charter should be as forward-looking as law or constitution. And even though we do not know when the pandemic will end, we have to forge policy that would very much address the issue of those who are so poor and so left out, and so will suffer, and whose successors on this earth will suffer. So we have to face the reality that there are some who are so poor as not to fit in properly in the social structure or the economic structure or the socio-economic structure, and who sometimes lack basic skills. And this is where the more privileged do have a duty.
I think he's just
care.
dropped out there, but
okay,
he's making fundamental point and reinforcing, which is really one of the key tenets of the Charter. I want to bring Sharita back in here because I know that there's a tie in here with the rights and responsibilities, but there seem a body of concern that is the very kernel of the Charter that I think that we need to make sure that people understand. And while you're at it, also make that distinction and respond to the Facebook question about whether the Charter is similar to the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Sharita?
Sorry, the dogs wanted to get in on the conversation, so I had it muted. So Reverend Rogers, as well as Dr. Murray, would have made some very, very critical points about the fact that we need more than legislation right now. Laws serve their purpose, but the relational crisis in this country that we're facing currently requires a lot more than legislation, and there's a gap that needs to be filled, and a step that we need to take before we get to speaking to procedural and legislative matters. And that is the gap that the Charter seeks to fill. Now, I would have mentioned earlier the difference between justiciable and non-justiciable, entrenched or unentrenched. Now, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, I suspect what the commenter meant was the Bill of Rights is entrenched in their constitution. Similarly, I think Canada also has an entrenched Bill of Rights in their constitution. What is being presented here is not justiciable and would not necessarily be entrenched. However, as Dr. Murray rightly pointed out, the question is on the table. What is the type of charter that you as Barbadians, that we as Barbadians want? Do you see a need for it to be justiciable? Do you see a need for it to be fully entrenched within the context of our Constitution? Should it be a standalone document, as Dr. Murray was alluding to earlier, that rises above, the temporary nature of laws and institutions, etc.? A document that, as I mentioned earlier, should be emblematic and continue beyond the here and now and into generations and future generations after that. The question is really on the table. So I toss the question back out to the commentator. What do you think what form do you think it should take?
All right, thank you. I know we miss a bit of a couple of words there at the end, but we got the gist of it from you, Sharita. But I think in all fairness, we should bring Michelle back in here because she's heard a lot of things going back and forth, and I'm sure that she's anxious to put her 2 cents on the table as well. Michelle?
I am. Poverty, the importance of eradicating poverty. I really would like to much of what you spoke about, the importance of the right to education, or rather, the importance of action. Well, I beg your pardon. The importance of can you hear me better this way? The importance of access to education, access to healthcare, access to housing. All of those things are human rights, are enshrined in international human rights law. And I frequently have discussions with others about whether or not poverty is a human rights violation, yes? To the extent that we are defining poverty as a lack of access to quality education, a lack of access to quality healthcare. And to be sure, the governments and the state have an obligation to provide the minimum essential levels of those kinds of rights, the minimum essential level of education, the minimal essential level of healthcare. And to the extent that poverty undermines that, poverty, eradicating poverty has to be a priority, because poverty undermines many of the rights that we protect in the Constitution or in our laws. So that is one. And then as it relates to the justiciability of the Charter and the enforceability of the Charter, I think it is important to have that conversation. But to be sure, it is also important to talk about enforceability of something that we say is justiciable, right? And as Sharita indicated before, it is not enough to just paper over things, pass legislation, adopt policy. The reality of that legislation and that policy has to be real on a daily basis. Persons have to be able to realize those rights on a daily basis, and the fact that they are on paper might not necessarily do so. And it's important that if we're going to write something down and say this is a right that the state must meet, or an obligation that the state must meet and the right that a person can exercise, we need to be sure that we have the institutions and mechanisms in place that, these actual, that whether it be the charter or our laws, are genuinely and properly enforced. So I just wanted to kind of make that point that, we can pass all the laws in the world, as Sharita said, but the reality is how we are going to treat each other. And certainly to the extent that we have a law, we need to be sure that we can actually exercise our rights under that law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's remind you again about the way that you can participate in this this program today, the public view. We want to hear from you. And the telephone number is 228-5562 and 228-5563. The WhatsApp number is 228-5562. And as I said before, it's great to leave a voice message. It works every time. And at CBC Barbados and at JS Barbados on Facebook is where you can catch and also leave your questions as well for the members of the panel. We're coming into some of the final moments here, and I just wanted to bring Dr. Murray back in, because I think the whole discussion of rights and responsibilities are really front and center. And based on your experience and training, etc., I'd give you an opportunity to really try and reinforce some of the values here and why it's so important for the Charter.
Sometimes these discussions could become abstract, or to some people may seem as though they're a little bit too removed from the day-to-day reality and issues. So I was glad that the issue of poverty, which is something tangible that people could identify with, came up. I want to add another, which is current, controversial, and immediate, but I think is a good example to get us thinking about how we should entrench rights and what the Charter should speak to in terms of what we will minimally accept. And this has to do with the ongoing pandemic. The great debate has been whether we should make vaccinations mandatory or not. And if we don't make them mandatory, whether we should have mandates where employers could impose conditions on the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and especially unvaccinated. So I want to draw reference to the fact that Barbados has made the decision. I must say that I'm proud that Barbados made the decision that we will not have mandatory vaccines. Other territories have also made that decision, but then they went on to have mandates and so on. I want to point out that the reason I feel that we made the correct decision is because ultimately the only thing that we have final control and sovereignty over our bodies, and we should have ultimate say over whether our bodies should be valued or not. And that is in terms of individual rights. And of course, the argument has been in terms of collective rights, we should be willing to give up that in the midst of a pandemic. So I think that our government made the correct decision in making it, in not insisting that vaccines be mandatory. And what that says is that in a charter, we would want to say something like, it's only in the most extreme of situations or crises that we will go of doing something like that in terms of infringing on your individual right over your body. I often have to remind people that that very right and some of those freedoms that we're now fairly casually, I shouldn't say casually, but that we've been given up. People go to war for these rights. People go to war and die willingly in their thousands for these rights. So I should remind people that we should be very, very careful. And some of those should be so sacred that it's only in the most extreme situations. Michelle mentioned earlier that we should have a very high bar for infringing some of these rights. And I think that in this situation, this is a tangible an immediate example that people can reflect on. If you had to reflect that position in a charter, that minimum beyond which we will not go in terms of infringing people's rights, and also demarcating what would be the extreme conditions under which we will allow infringement of those rights. How would we shape that and language it to be in a charter? And that is what I think that we should reflect on in terms of what should be in a charter. What are the extreme conditions and what are the frames? What's the boundaries that should hold and constrain any constitution regardless of its manifestation, and the laws that flow from them in terms of our humanity, our rights, respects, and dignity. In other words, much of what Michelle has been saying, but different.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. We're on the home stretch now. And because we've had the benefit of you as one of our guests this afternoon on the panel, I'd like to also want to thank you indeed, as well as the Center for Hybrid Studies, for your contribution today. The conversation continues, and I would like to invite Ms. Michelle Brathwaite, who is the Regional Coordinator, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for her final thoughts before we wrap on this afternoon's session and come back on Saturday. So, Michelle?
Thank you very much. I mean, the conversation that we've had this afternoon has been incredibly interesting and inspiring. I definitely think that we got into some areas of rights considerations, and like I said, fundamental human rights principles that I would hope that we continue this conversation, yes? Whether not just about as it relates to certain groups, but even our development concerns and the rights issues that underlie them. So we talked about property already, we talked about employment. There are a number of different ways in which our development agenda is directly affected by our human rights agenda. And I think that the nature of the conversations we had today were very encouraging. I am delighted to hear that persons understand that, you know, some of these more, you know, kind of complex concepts are human rights concepts. Human rights it has a broad scope. And as I said before, it is applicable to everyone. And the nature of the conversation we had today, I think, was a very good Barbados-specific conversation about how we are going to understand rights in our own national context. So I am delighted with the conversation that we had this afternoon. I sincerely hope that I can continue to be a part of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you too for your contribution. Of course, we want to thank the two people at the helm of the RSTAC subcommittee that is leading this discussion on the draft charter of Barbados. I'd like to end where the draft charter ends, and it states, "We, the people of this great nation, Barbados, encouraged by the resilience and ingenuity of those who came before us, stand on the threshold of a bright future that we boldly embrace and solemnly affirm the aspirations contained in this Charter of Barbados. May the hope it engenders permeate the length and breadth of this nation and distinguish it as a land of equal opportunity and enfranchisement, fairness and social justice, peace and security, solidarity and cooperation. May the commitment we now champion progressively foster and nurture the soul of our nation from generation to generation." Let us walk with that in our hearts and in our minds until we meet again on Saturday at 5 o'clock for another discussion on another aspect of our draft charter as we walk towards making a Barbadian our head of state in 2 months' time. But more importantly, that you continue to give the public view to the work that has been done on this charter. So thanks to my co-host, Julian Rogers, and indeed to the panel, as well as the RSTAC, for making this possible. And we look forward to the continued conversations on Saturday at 5 o'clock, and then again on Monday, the 4th of October, Wednesday, the 6th of October, and we wrap it all up on Friday, the 8th of October. Until then, please do stay safe. Delta is no respecter of persons. We're happy that you could join us safely, virtually, and we urge you all to continue to contribute. Don't forget, you can submit your audio and video submissions via email and ensure that your voice is heard and reflected in the Charter. Good evening, and see you over on Saturday.